Good morning to everyone here, and good morning to all those people who have decided to join us online. So as Mel said, we have a slightly shorter session this morning. We've got 2.5 hours together where we're going to talk about RTO governance. So these are some very famous names that you see up here on the board. And all of them have actually experienced a really significant failure in governance. So if we just wanted to look at a couple of them, Volkswagen, for example, that's a company that probably reputationally has been damaged forever by the emissions scandal that they had. That basically they falsified emissions testing data. And, you know, for the company, that has cost them their reputation about $16 billion for rectifications of that. And then there are also criminal charges brought against a number of the senior management in that company. Things like Commonwealth Bank, we've all seen the Royal Commission that we've had around the banking sector and the kinds of issues that have happened there. And of course, you know, the vet sector is not immune from these kinds of issues. So there's a few RTOs that are sitting at the bottom there. We have had private vet providers who have collapsed with, you know, leaving tens of thousands of students without courses. Some of those companies have had upwards of $40 million that they have had to pay back through to the government. And all of these things are about failures in governance in the organisations. Now, while all of those failures are very large-scale failures, those same kinds of failures happen at a small scale as well. And we see them every day, and you potentially have even experienced them yourself. So the idea of this workshop is to have a look at those things that within our current regulation, and I'll say current regulation because it's under review, within our current regulation are focused on around governance, and to give you some ideas about the kinds of things that you might be able to look out for within your own organisations or consider in your own organisations that might help prevent any kind of governance failure in your organisation. So you'll notice that we've got a few empty desks in the room. There might be people who join us through the morning, so we will just keep going, and if they join us, they join us. So our objectives for today's session are to make sure that we look at those elements of good governance that are related to these 4 key areas which sit within our regulation. So we're going to have a look at, first of all, what governance means and the kinds of requirements that sit in place around planning. We'll briefly look at the fit and proper persons requirements, which has got nothing to do with whether you've been to the gym or not today. Too hot to go to the gym, hopefully we'll go for a swim afterwards. RTO records management, and we're also going to look at third-party arrangements, which of course is a focus for all the regulators who work within our sector. Is there anyone in the room who is regulated by ASQA? Okay, all right. So obviously you have some extra general directions that you deal with around third-party arrangements. So we have, as I said, about 2.5 hours to talk through this. We'll have about a 10 to 15 minute break. I think the sooner we can finish today, probably the better, considering we don't really have air conditioning. And for those people who are online and aren't with us, it's going to be 40 degrees here today. So, you know, please ask questions whenever you would like to, including those people online. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you was there anything in particular in signing up for this workshop today that you wanted to take away from the workshop? Did you have any burning questions or areas that you wanted talked about?
Just to focus on third-party arrangements, just the
Yep.
determination of them
Yep.
and commencement of them.
Okay, got to wait for the microphone.
Yeah. Just to focus on third-party arrangements, looking at commencement and completion of those and a continuation if it rolls over.
Okay. Okay. Well, we've got quite a big session on third-party arrangements. So I think that'll be covered. Okay, so first of all, governance. What is this thing called governance? So really what this is about managing your organisation or your company well. So we're talking about one-person organisations, and we're talking about enormous organisations with thousands of members. We are talking about public sector organisations, private organisations, not-for-profit organisations. It doesn't matter what kind of organisation you run. It needs to be run well, because what we want to assure is that the outcomes that you achieve are because of what you do and not in spite of what you do. It's not just about good luck. So when we think about governance, governance is really about the systems that you put in place that control the way your organisation operates and the mechanisms by which the people in it are held to account. So it often includes a whole range of factors within your organisation. So you can see here we're talking about ethics, risk management, compliance, administration. They're all elements that have to be considered and taken into account when you're thinking about good governance. So governance is actually really intimately linked with regulation. Regulation are the rules that are made by a government which hope to, in fact, control the way you would do things as an organisation. And primarily when we're looking at regulation, regulation is about making sure or protecting the people who seek services from your organisation. So when we link these two things together, we're saying the government is saying, as a minimum, you need to do these things to protect the students who come to you in an RTO. And then within your own organisations, your government systems are about how you make sure that those regulations are enacted appropriately in your organisation. And of course, that looks different in different organisations. So when you think about your one-person RTO that, you know, maybe operates in a remote area of Western Australia, of which there are lots of them, where, you know, maybe the RTO basically runs out of the car that person travels in, as opposed to some of our big TAFE organisations. It can never look the same in every organisation. So part of what we'll talk about today is how, when you think about these concepts, they could be applied to the size and scale and scope of what you do. And in our audits, of course, we're always looking to make sure that you have taken those things into account and that you've put systems in place that are appropriate for you. So for example, when we see new RTOs come into the system, often they have really complex policies, procedures, forms, tools, and there's one person. And when we come and have a look 12 months, 24 months down the line, and we go, how's it working for you? They're not doing anything that they said they were going to do because it's impossible to do. So we want to be very, very sure that the kinds of systems that you put in place to control and hold people to account are in fact suitable for you. So there's lots of benefits of having a good governance system in place. So typically when you have good governance, people's trust in you increases because you have a good reputation. So people talk, and Perth is a very, very small place, and people know which organisations do a great job, which organisations don't do a great job. And the thing with trust is that people, when people feel that they can rely on you to provide them with a quality product or service, generally that leads to increased levels of trust. Generally, good governance will enhance the sustainability of an organisation, and this is really about you being able to quickly identify and resolve the problems that pop up in every organisation. No organisation is perfect. We're all going to have problems at some point in time. So we're looking to see how the systems that you have got in place in fact work to do what you intend them to do. And really what that is about safeguarding your reputation and safeguarding the future of the organisation. So typically good governance will also encourage positive behaviours in your organisation. When people have real clarity around what it is they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it, and they know that they will be held account for what they do, then they tend to behave in the way that you would actually want them to. When we talk about minimising risk and corruption, again, that's having a good eye over everything. And typically what happens is you have increased levels of transparency in an organisation. And so what happens then is when you can see everything that, of course, that is happening, you do minimise that risk. Often an organisation that is seen to be stable, reliable, and able to mitigate against the risks that happen is also likely to have better access to funding as well, whether that be government funding or whether it be private equity funding. So these are just some of the benefits that good governance provides to an organisation. What else do you think good governance might do for your organisation? Open to the floor.
I think it just helps to build. I think it just helps to build team morale when things are clicking along the way they should be.
Yes.
Instead of always being constant tensions.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And we've all worked.
One guy working in the car.
Yes. Well, it might still build your morale when it makes your job easier because everything just flows. Yes. Okay. Anything else that you think might be a benefit of governance, good governance in your organisation?
I think it does increase efficiency and productivity throughout the team as well.
Say that again for the microphone.
Yeah, I think it increases team efficiency and productivity on an overall, if we see it.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of the key things around that is, well, in the coming up to 40 years that I've worked in this sector, is that when we see organisations that actually have good processes in place, clear systems, and everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing, that's just a natural outcome of that. And the other thing, you know, that it does is in terms of teamwork and collaboration, opens up communication around things that aren't working. And people feel safe to say, this isn't working for me, and there's a better way to do this, and they will do that. So there's some very positive things. Mel?
Sharon Richards says, clarity for trainers and admin.
Yes, definitely. So clarity is a big message that's coming out here, isn't it? So I have seen plenty of organisations when I have looked at their policies and processes and systems where if I was a worker in that organisation, I really wouldn't know what to do. The procedure doesn't tell me anything. And one organisation actually asked them about this and said, you know, how or why have you got procedures that don't say anything? And their response was, our consultant told us to leave it wide open, that way we couldn't be held non-compliant. So that consultant was accurate, didn't say anything, but the consequence for the organisation, of course, is that no one knew what to do. So it's a bit of a risk-reward type equation that you have to look at there. So there are lots and lots of benefits of good governance in an organisation and our regulation. So we have some specific standards in our regulation that are about governance. The first of those is Standard 5. Standard 5 really focuses on making sure that we as RTOs keep everybody fully informed about what we are actually going to do for them, what they are buying for the money that they give us, and how they will be protected as a student of our RTO. And that not is only in place for the students who might engage with us directly, but is also in place for any student who might engage with us through a third party. So if we have a third party offering any type of service for us, it might be recruiting, it might be fee collection, it might be training and assessment, it might be some kind of support service that third party offers. Whatever it is they do, the students have to know what that party is going to do, but also that you are the RTO and that you are their point of contact. We also have Standard 7. Well, 7 and 8 actually sit in a section called Governance, so it's pretty clear those would be included. So Standard 7 is about really the governance and admin procedures that might be in place within an organisation, and that's where the fit and proper persons requirements sit. And then Standard 8 is about how each RTO will in fact cooperate with their vet regulator, whoever that vet regulator is. And there are 3 regulators in the vet sector. And how you make sure that you are legally compliant at all times. And again, you know, when we talk about legal compliance, each regulator has its own way of doing things, and our vet regulators may not be the only regulators that you are dealing with. So, for example, you might offer forklift training, in which case you might be dealing with WorkSafe. You might be delivering in the maritime area, in which case you'll be working with AMSA. So there's often lots of other regulators involved as well. And this is also where we have the record keeping information in our standards. And record keeping is one of the most common questions that we get asked in audits. What do we have to keep and why do we have to keep it and for how long? So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about those things today. So while these standards have a really specific focus on governance aspects of what we do, the reality is, because of the way our regulation is written, there are governance aspects that actually sit throughout our regulation. So we've tried to lay that out for you a little bit pictorially. So first of all, these top standards are standards really that is a benchmark for every RTO that comes into our sector to meet. So we have to make sure that the right people are running the RTO, and that any RTO that we have in our sector is financially viable. So that's a benchmark for everyone, irrespective of which regulator you work with. Then we have a whole pile of business processes that are in fact linked to different standards within our regulation. So for example, decision making and oversight sits in Standard 7, but making sure that our trainers and assessors are the right trainers and assessors sits in Standard 1. We focus on marketing and promotion in Standards 4 and 5, and enrolment also in Standard 5. The resources, equipment and facilities that we use to service the students that come to us sit in Standard 1. Delivery and assessment is overall governed by Standards 1 and 2, and of course Standard 2 is focused on continuous improvement and monitoring the third parties who are involved with you. We have complaints and appeals in Standard 6. Certification is Standard 3. Third party agreements are touched in 3 standards. 2, 5 and 8. So 2 is monitoring them, 5 is making sure that we've given the right information about them, and 8 is making sure we've informed the regulators about them. And of course records management, which underpins just about everything that you have got sitting above it, is touched on in Standards 2, 3, 7 and 8. So these standards are interwoven and linked, and you need to take that into consideration. Now, I am not sure how many of you regularly visit the TAC website, but we have it's a week and a half ago, released a new version of the user's guide. So even for those of you who are registered with ASQA, I think you'll find the user's guide useful. In the user's guide, right from the socially distanced picture on the front, through to the text in there, you will find that as a clause has been talked about in the standards, all the clauses that are related to it and what those things might mean are highlighted. So you get to understand the flow of how these standards are supposedly working. So these are key functions in an organisation that you would definitely need to be focusing on, and of course we have a fact sheet that could help you with this, the governance fact sheet, and I think you have it in your pack on your desks. Okay, so when we think about governance, we're really thinking about what risks does our RTO have that could compromise us providing a quality outcome to our students. So the risk to compliance is only one of many, many risks that an RTO might face. And so what I want you to do is to think about the risks that you face in your RTO. And I want you to do this as a group. So, for example, you might turn around and talk to the people behind you. And I want you to basically create a list. And in that list, you're to write down the risks that are relevant to you in your RTO, and then think about what clause of the standards might be linked to the risks that you face in your RTO. For those people who are online, if you're in a group online, do it in the same way. If you are by yourself, then if you could just write that list and pop it in the chat box, and Mel will contribute to the discussion on your behalf when we come back to discussion. So for this, I want to give you about 10 minutes to come up with your list, and then we'll come back together as a group and discuss your findings. Okay, let's get started again. So, risks in your RTO and how they link to potentially or impact our regulatory standards. So who would like to go first?
So in our team, we agreed that the biggest risk was staffing. So not only having a shortage of staff, but staff who were qualified enough to deliver the product the way it's supposed to be delivered.
Okay, and of course that links to clauses. Awesome.
Yes.
But primarily probably your strategy for delivery and assessment, and 113 to 116 about having the right staff in place.
Yes.
And it would also be your marketing, because if you can't deliver as to how you have marketed this qualification to people, then that is impacted as well. And so what kinds of strategies did you have? I know I didn't ask you to talk about this, but I feel you might have talked about some of these things. Did you have any strategies for how you might manage that in your RTOs?
Strategies to manage staffing. Well, that's really difficult. If you think about it, if you're short-staffed as it is, you may not have the staff to manage it, to get the job done. And we come from government, so Department of Justice, and the prisons are short-staffed at the moment, and we have to train staff, and some of those trainers come from the prisons, so they're prison officers themselves. Yep. So to take them out of the prisons to deliver the training, to train up more prison officers, it's a catch-22. So it makes it very, very difficult. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Did you have any ideas about?
We're pretty much the same with staff. I mean, we're in an industry at the moment that has actually pretty much been stripped bare. So the industry itself is screaming for technicians, and then we need trainers. There's no pool left at all because they're being offered absolutely crazy money out in industry to stay in industry.
Yes.
So our pool is gone.
Okay. And which industry?
Light vehicle apprenticeships.
Okay.
Yeah, automotive.
Yep. Yep. Okay. So that's very difficult.
Very, very difficult to,
and
very, very, very difficult to come up with strategies to try and manage that, because it changes, when there's a lot of out there, the strategy is completely different to what it is now, to try and resource it.
Okay. So I'm just thinking about that. I know of one organisation that they worked in the oil and gas industry, and they had exactly the same type of issue. There's no way they could match the salaries that fully qualified people were paid to work in the oil and gas industry. And so what they did is they brought people in and trained them in bits. So they weren't fully qualified. They wouldn't be sucked out into the industry because they couldn't do the jobs in industry, but they could do little bits of it. And so they kept their people in that way. But, I mean, it was also expensive because they had to have more staff, but not as expensive as trying to match the salaries. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, what about this group? Because I know you guys talked about staffing as well. Yes.
So We were talking about having casual staff.
Yes.
And also about them maybe going sick very short notice, as in like less than an hour before the session starts.
Yep.
And how it was harder to manage because they were on, like compared to the full-time staff or part-time staff, those on a contract, it was a little bit harder to manage because there was no kind of long-term process in terms of
like a performance measurement against whether they.
So with the contracted staff, you can kind of go to them and say you've had 6 days off sick. And then on top of that, because we were struggling to find people that had the industry experience and the teaching experience, you were kind of in this kind of like loop where you had to use those casual staff. So.
Okay. So did you come up with any strategies around it as a group?
I think mentors, I think what we discussed, they may be not the 100% solution, but if we can find some mentors and train them, that could assist, but it doesn't solve the problem completely though.
No.
Yeah.
No. And for a lot of organisations, this growing their capability and that succession planning and cross-training. So, if and it happens differently in different organisations, but often if there is a particular area where you can program things so that there can always be an alternative and that you've always got people who can staff the alternative, that's one way of thinking about things there. Yeah. Okay, what about you guys?
We spoke about financial risk and reputation risk.
Yes.
So particularly with this year being the year that it has been, and RTOs having to move into the online space in a very short time frame, and depending on what you're delivering and how you're delivering it, the numbers fluctuating with COVID and everything, then obviously the financial risk becomes quite significant.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I was talking to an RTO the other day that said even though they have operated the whole time through COVID, they have had a 70% impact on their revenue stream because they have their class size are reduced much more because they have to spread them all out. So they're paying their trainers 3 times what would have been one class. So it's an enormous risk, yes.
And that links into reputation as well, because for RTOs who weren't prepared to move online, if it's not done properly, then that impacts your reputation.
That's right. Electronic books is not online learning. Indeed. Thank you.
We talked about pressures.
Got to have the microphone.
Sorry. We talked about pressures. So we're an enterprise RTO.
Yep.
So we get pressures from the company to get people trained ASAP.
Yes.
We had, I don't know how many, a couple of hundred people to get through Cert 2, Cert 3 this year. We haven't met it because the sheer volume and the volume of learning. And the business doesn't always understand about volume of learning.
Great.
They think they can sit in an 8-hour classroom and get 12 units done.
Yep.
So yeah.
I mean, you can't do that?
No. Give us 2 days. So,
well, you can, but we'll be on your doorstep the next day going, you can't.
Which also leads into staffing. We're struggling to find rail trainers at the moment.
Yes.
So
yes.
And then the link on for that for us is also the general understanding of what RTO obligations are from the business. So we struggle because, train 12 units in 8 days, or, well, can't you just RPL them? And in their mind, that's an assessor just coming out and observing a task. And so also the education of the business around us to be able to say, these are our standards, this is what we have to work within, and then this is how you can facilitate this and help it, rather than we have a project coming up, we need 76 people trained tomorrow. So.
Yes. And one of the things that I've often found in organisations, and this is often where an enterprise RTO exists, is that when they look at their project planning, so for example, building multiple rail lines, and what they would need to staff that and manage and run that rail line, some of the people that they need on the ground takes 5 years to build those people, to grow those people. So you can't, 12 months before it starts running, say, give me so many communication techs, because they take 5 years to grow. So that, and often it's going back into those other project planning processes in the organisation and just putting that bit in the project that you have to have consideration of the training pathways, not how many people you need in what job, but the pathway to get those people into the job helps.
Yeah.
Okay, and Mel, you've got some comments from our online people.
Yes, quite a few. So I won't say verbatim, but basically meeting licence requirements, third-party arrangements, workplace processes, lack of unity within the RTO, adhering to good governance, like the compliance officer knows how things should be run, but the manager, owners won't follow the rules. Also because the finances are too tight to maintain rigorous compliance. Trainers and assessors not having the correct up-to-date qualifications, experience, training rooms and other resources not fit for purpose. Record-keeping parameters, back-end filing, updating of policies. Students not completing, not enough students to make a class financially viable. Lack of placement. Reporting requirements which are costly to administration. RTOs not considering continuous improvements, dysfunctional RTOs, legal issues, bad reputation, bad data reporting, and a trainer matrix not competent, trainers not maintaining their currency and not understanding RTO compliance requirements.
We're in big trouble, aren't we? Okay, so when we think about the things that we have talked about here and the contribution from our online people, the reality is that those risks that we have identified and talked about, and all the time that I've been working in this sector, they're the same risks that we have always talked about. And the same challenges that we have faced, and it tends to be sometimes a little bit cyclic in where we get these challenges. So when we have booms in industries, we can't pay the trainers, then all of a sudden we have lots of them that we can't do anything with. So it's not a new situation. And I think one of the real benefits of this type of forum is, of course, getting to share some of that information with the others and picking up on the ideas that some of the others have. So I'd encourage you to keep maintaining the network from this session and to talk to each other about what it is you do and what you have found successful and not successful. All of those things are things that we go, yes, we know that's a risk there, but if we actually think about it and think about some strategies for how we might manage it, we're trying. We're trying to do those things. Not to say they will always work, but we can try. Okay, so this is one of the first of our regulatory requirements, the fit and proper persons requirements, and you have got a copy of this sheet on your desks. So it's actually a form that our regulator sends out to you, and for the ASQA registered RTOs, of course, there's also a fit and proper persons declaration that you will fill out. And fundamentally, the fit and proper persons declarations are about making sure that we have the right people running the RTO. People who are going to have the best interests of the organisation and the students at heart as they make decisions about how the organisation operates. And that's the real key to all of this. These requirements apply to the people who make decisions about how the RTO operates. So when we look at these, they're focused on some big picture things. So they're focused on past criminal convictions and whether that conviction would mean or would impact your ability to run an RTO. So having a criminal conviction doesn't necessarily preclude you from running an RTO. It depends what you did. They look at the financial records of the people who are involved. They look at business histories, for example, bankruptcies and things like that, failed businesses, deregistrations in other RTOs, which of course links to your RTO history. So if you have been involved in a string of RTOs that have had significant problems, obviously you're going to be put under the spotlight. So these declarations are filled out by the legally responsible people and what we call higher managerial agents. So those higher managerial agents are listed on page 2 of that declaration. So when you have a look at this list, you'll see that, as I said earlier, these are really about decision makers in the organisation, so compliance managers, marketing managers, training managers, someone who has an ongoing role related to regulatory compliance, and that can often be a consultant coming into the organisation. Someone who represents the RTO at audit, people employed in third-party organisations to fulfil any of these types of roles. So all of these people make decisions about the operation and therefore have to meet these requirements. So they will fill in this form, and then this form goes through to the regulators, and the regulators will look at the information in there and make a decision about whether you're the right person to be involved with an RTO. So in ASQA's case, that will go through to the Commissioner, and in tax case, it goes through the Training Accreditation Council. So one of the things with making sure that you have good governance in an organisation is obviously you have these people who are key decision makers in the organisation, and they formally need to fill out this requirement. But I think you also need to think a little bit more broadly about who makes decisions in your organisation, and the reality is everybody makes decisions in your organisation to some degree. So if you think about making sure that you have got the right people in your organisation, then some of the things that you might want to consider beyond whether there is just a tick in the box for the qualifications that we normally look at is whether that person is the right person for your organisation against potentially some other criteria, for example, upholding your values and things like that. So everyone in our organisation is decision makers. Some of those key decision makers are subject to this formal requirement to meet the fit and proper persons requirements that sit in our regulation. So every RTO will also have processes of some kind within their organisation. So there will typically be policy documents. So a policy document is really about you stating your intent about how you want to do things. So it's the what are we going to do and the why statement that sits around it. A lot of our policy documents are things that we present publicly so that people know what to expect of us behaviourally when they engage with our organisation. So this should be a really clear statement that helps guide the way we operate. The process documents, which you might call a whole range of things, you might call them procedures, you might call them processes, you might call them work instructions, there could be all kinds of things, are really the how and when type documents. This is the thing that is helpful to the staff to guide how you want them to actually complete a task. So when you look at that, you would go, well, that's pretty simple, right? Not really. When we spend time in RTOs, we often find that organisations are significantly challenged when we think about their policies and processes. So these are the kinds of things that are extremely common for us to see in audit situations. So often they'll have systems that don't reflect the way they operate at all, and I am still, to this day, gobsmacked by organisations that run 2 systems, one for audit and one for how they actually do business. It happens. It happens. The processes are so vague that they simply restate the standard. So that's also a very common thing, and it's a very, very common thing in commercial products. So there's nothing wrong with buying a commercial product, a set of policies and procedures, but they all require substantial customizations to actually suit the way you operate in your organisation. Sometimes the processes that you see there are the exact opposite. They are so complicated that they're actually impossible to implement, and staff are super confused about what it is that they're supposed to do. And sometimes I spend a couple of hours of my audit actually showing staff what their policies and procedures are. They're a mystery to them. So one of the things that we will often do in audit situations is ask to have a look at your policies and procedures beforehand, because they're things that we just have to read through so that we can understand how you're operating. So I've seen them, I've read them, and I know about the forms, and then I talk to your staff and they go, well, we don't have anything that does that. And I go, well, actually you do. Here it is. And often because organisations will give us links to their own system, I can even show them where it is in their system, but the staff don't know. So in situations where this is happening, you can imagine in my audit day, I've got little alarm bells ringing, you know, behind my ears when I see any of these things, because it tells me that this is not doing probably what it is supposed to do. So when we have this type of situation, the kinds of risks for the RTO are that often they won't meet the needs of the learner with the services that they're providing, and it also often flows through to other parts of the business. So you'll often find there's some financial problems or there's some administrative problems as well. It's not just the learner, it tends to seek everywhere. So what we want to do is we want to put policies and processes in place that actually minimise the risk for our organisation and maximise the outcomes or the potential for positive outcomes for our students in the provision of quality training and assessment. Now, we're going to take about 10 minutes, which is going to take us up to maybe morning tea, depends when it arrives, to watch a video that some of you might have seen before. Others of you may not have seen this video before. It's a really nice way of thinking about how processes work in an organisation and how you can map these processes out. So for the people who are online, if you can watch this video, it's about 9 minutes long, so we will come back in 10 minutes for our online people and talk about what you took away from this video.
Some years ago, I stumbled across a simple design exercise that helps people understand and solve complex problems. And like many of these design exercises, it kind of seems trivial at first, but under deep inspection, it turns out that it reveals unexpected truths about the way that we collaborate and make sense of things. The exercise has 3 parts and it begins with something that we all know how to do, which is how to make toast. It begins with a clean sheet of paper, a felt marker, and without using any words, you begin to draw how to make toast. And most people draw something like this. They draw a loaf of bread, which is sliced, then put into a toaster. The toaster is then deposited for a course of time. It pops up, and then voila, after 2 minutes, toast and happiness. Now, over the years, I've collected many hundreds of drawings of these toasts, and some of them are very good because they really illustrate the toast-making process quite clearly. And then there are some that are, well, not so good. They really suck, actually, because you don't know what they're trying to say. under close inspection, some reveal some aspects of toast making while hiding others. So there's some that's all about the toast, right? And there's all about the transformation of toast. And there's others that are all about the toaster, okay? And the engineers love to draw the mechanics of this. And then there are others that are about people. You know, it's about visualizing the experience that people have. And then there are others that are about the supply chain of making toast that goes all the way back to the store. It goes through the supply chain networks of teleportation and all the way back to the field and wheat. And that one actually goes all the way back to the Big Bang. So it's crazy stuff. But I think it's obvious that even though these drawings are really wildly different, they share a common quality, and I'm wondering if you can see it. Do you see it? What's common about these? So most drawings have nodes and links. So nodes represent the tangible objects like the toaster and people, and links represent the connections between the nodes. And it's the combination of links and nodes that produces a full systems model. It makes our private mental models visible about how we think something works. So that's the value of these things. And what's interesting about these systems models is how they reveal our various points of view. So for example, Americans make toast with a toaster. That seems obvious. Whereas many Europeans make toast with a frying pan, of course. And many students make toast with a fire. I don't really understand this. A lot of MBA students do this. So you can measure the complexity by counting the number of nodes, and the average illustration has between 4 and 8 nodes. At less than that, the drawing seems trivial, but it's quick to understand. And more than 13, the drawing produces a feeling of map shock. It's too complex. So the sweet spot is between 5 and 13. So if you want to communicate something visually, have between 5 and 13 nodes in your diagram. So though we may not be skilled at drawing, the point is that we intuitively know how to break down complex things into simple things and then bring them back together again. So this brings us to our second part of the exercise, which is how to make toast, but now with sticky notes or with cards. So what happens then? Well, with cards, most people tend to draw clear, more detailed, and more logical notes. You can see the step-by-step analysis that takes place. And as they build up their model, they move their nodes around, kind of rearranging them like Lego blocks. Now, though this might seem trivial, it's actually really important. This rapid iteration of expressing and then reflecting and analyzing is really the only way in which we get clarity. It's the essence of the design process. And system theorists do tell us that the ease with which we can change a representation correlates to our willingness to improve the model. So sticky note systems are not only more fluid, they generally produce way more nodes than static drawings. The drawings are much richer. And this brings us to our third part of the exercise, which is to draw how to make toast, but this time in a group. So what happens then? Well, here's what happens. It starts out messy, and then it gets really messy, and then it gets messier. But as people refine the models, the best nodes become more prominent, and with each iteration, the model becomes clearer, and because people build on top of each other's ideas. What emerges is a unified systems model that integrates the diversity of everyone's individual points of view. And so that's a really different outcome from what usually happens in meetings, isn't it? So these drawings can contain 20 or more nodes, but participants don't feel map shock because they participate in the building of their models themselves. Now, what's also really interesting that the groups spontaneously mix and add additional layers of organization to it. To deal with contradictions, for example, they add branching patterns and parallel patterns. Oh, by the way, if they do it in complete silence, they do it much better and much more quickly. Really interesting. Talking gets in the way. So here's some key lessons that can emerge from this. First, drawing helps us understand the situations as systems with nodes and their relationships. Movable cards produce better systems models because we iterate much more fluidly. And then the group notes produce the most comprehensive models because we synthesize several points of view. So that's interesting. When people work together under the right circumstances, group models are much better than individual models. And so this approach works really great for drawing how to make toast. But what if you wanted to draw something more relevant or pressing, like your organizational vision, or customer experience, or long-term sustainability? There's a visual revolution that's taking place as more organizations are addressing their wicked problems by collaboratively drawing them out. And I'm convinced that those who see their world as movable nodes and links really have an edge. And the practice is really pretty simple. You start with a question, you collect the nodes, you refine the nodes, you do it over again, you refine and refine and refine, and the patterns emerge. And the group gets clarity, and you answer the question. So this simple act of visualizing and doing it over and over again produces some really remarkable outcomes. What's really important to know is that it's the conversations that are the important aspects, not just the models themselves. And these visual frames of reference can grow to several hundreds or even thousands of nodes. So one example is from an organization called Rodale, big publishing company. They lost a bunch of money one year, and their executive team for 3 days visualized their entire practice. And what's interesting is that after visualizing the entire business, systems upon systems, they reclaimed $50 million of revenue, and they also moved from a D rating to an A rating from their customers. Why? Because there's alignment from the executive team. So I'm now on a mission to help organizations solve their wicked problems by using collaborative visualization. On a site that I've produced called DrawToast.com, I've collected a bunch of the really, I think, best practices, and so you can learn how to run a workshop here. You can learn more about the visual language and the structure of links and nodes that you can apply to general problem solving, and download examples of various templates for unpacking the thorny problems that we all face in our organizations. So the seemingly trivial design exercise of drawing toast helps us get clear, engaged, and aligned. So next time you're confronted with an interesting challenge, remember what design has to teach us. Make your ideas visible, tangible, and consequential. It's simple, it's fun, it's powerful, and I believe it's an idea worth celebrating. Thank you.
Okay, so while TAC is not standing here saying you have to use this video or you have to use this approach, planning is an approach that is an important part. Planning is an important part of any governance system in terms of deciding how you're going to work and what it looks like in practice. And this is just one way to do that. But it's also a super effective way of doing it, which is why we have chosen the video. Does anyone use this type of approach in their organisations now? No? Yes? Yeah. So it can be applied very broadly. And for those of you who have used this, what's your feeling about it, Peter?
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It reinforced what we should have been doing on a much smaller scale.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to.
Yeah, it just reinforces some really key things that you can do quickly to achieve process much better than how we ordinarily do it. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And one of the things that I have found in organisations that use this, because sometimes I come in as a facilitator to do this with organisations, and you have this group of people and they all do their nodes, and it's not until the people in the organisation see the other people's nodes that they even understand how their bit of the process impacts everybody else. So it's often a really educative process as well as to how the organisations run and to why you get problems in particular places. Okay, so was there any feedback from the online people about what they took from the video? No. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do now is have a morning tea break. for 15 minutes. Our morning tea is up the back, and then when we come back, we're going to use the Post-it notes that I've just popped on your desks. So you can madly think about what I might be going to ask you to do while you're having a cup of tea and something to nibble on. So please enjoy your morning tea. 15 minutes, that brings us back at 10:25. So before we went on a break, you'll notice that I put some Post-it notes on your desk, and what I want to do now is to actually just have a bit of a try at that process that we just watched on the video. And again, I would like you probably to do this in your groups. I think you'll find it more useful doing it in your groups. And what we want you to do is we want you to focus on marketing, because marketing is something that basically every RTO does in one way or another. And we want you to think about what happens in your RTO in terms of marketing, and do basically a fast brainstorm of the nodes that exist for you for marketing. And then within your group, talk about how things might happen differently, what extra things might be put in, what you might arrange, so that you've got something that looks like a marketing process that might be effective for your organisation. When we come back together as a wider group, which I think should be probably about 15 minutes, and then we'll talk about how you found that exercise. So that fast brainstorm of getting things down on the notes in about 7 minutes, and then about the same time again to talk about rearrange and tweak. Okay? So what did you find when you went through that exercise? Will you need a microphone? Peter?
We found that you get good collaboration from each other. So you bounce off each other, different ideas that you wouldn't have thought of before comes out.
Yep.
The other is we all think about the same sorts of things. So it's common, which is quite interesting as well.
Yes. Yes. It's good. Anything else? Yes?
Yes, it dawned on us that we do everything backwards. So we attract people with the position first, and then we tell them, if you want the job, you have to do your Cert 3 in correctional practice. So we attract them with videos, and this is what it's like, this is what work-life balance, it's a great job, but you have to do the Cert 3. So we do it backwards.
So it's like a sweetener at the end.
Yes.
Or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you say anything in the job advertising about doing the training? You don't say we'll provide training? Or
no,
anything
in the
like
marketing, the early marketing, it's all around getting them to the advertised job position, and within the job position on the MyGov, that's where you'll see that there's a requirement for the certificate.
Okay.
So not up until that point.
Okay. Do you think that's reasonable?
I think it is, but I think that our advertising doesn't give a very good picture of what the job is really about, because we have some people who come to the academy and they don't realise that this is a difficult job. They think it's going to be a huggy, wear fluffy gloves and be nice to prisoners, and they'll be better and they'll never offend again. So I don't think our advertising is accurate.
Okay. Okay. Something to take back and think about. Yeah.
Oh, I've thought about it a lot.
Yes. Or maybe convince other people to think about it a bit more.
We also found that depending on our role and our experience, we each had a different focus on the process.
Yes.
So, so Peter's got a great all-round experience. So he had a good idea of the whole process from go to woe. Actually, we found it as a cycle. Whereas my experience was around the content and information, making sure it's accurate and up to date.
Yes.
So we all brought something different.
Yes. And I noticed in this group, it's the same kind of thing. We've got one person in an RTO and a new person into the RTO. And looking at the standards, I watched you guys do it, where Emmy, you were saying, oh, where's that? Should that be in there? So often as subject matter experts, we make assumptions about things in this kind of process, especially if you have a range of people involved. Those assumptions get highlighted. And then you can figure out whether it's okay for it not to be there or if it really is something that should to be in there. So that all those different views are really important in the process, hence why the group process works better. Yeah, thank you. And anything from online, Belle?
No.
No? Okay. So it's a really interesting process that you can apply in lots of ways in your organisations, and it's worth playing with. As I was just saying here, I do it all the time. I have a drawer of Post-it notes at home, all different sizes, colours, shapes, and my walls are often plastered. People walk in and they go, oh, what have you been doing? So when we think about what we have talked about so far, we've really talked about the what and the how things of this so far. And in terms of finalising any process in your organisation, you also have to think about these things. So once you can lay down the kinds of steps that should happen in your processes, you can start to think about who's going to do them, when they're going to do them, where they're going to do them, all those kinds of things. So we need a full cycle in there. So the other thing is, with the best of intentions, we'll go through and we'll create these processes for our organisation, and sometimes they work beautifully, sometimes they don't quite do what we intended them to do, and sometimes some of the drivers for these processes in fact change. So once we have some kind of process in place, then we should have some kind of continual improvement and monitoring process in place to make sure that it's working for us. So we have to be looking at what these external requirements are and making sure that we're aware of all of the changes that sit in those. And these will be different for everybody. So we will all have different customer groups or client groups. We will all have different regulatory type requirements, and of course we will all have different environmental impacts that we work within. So all of these things tend to drive what sits in our defined management system, which is our policies and processes and forms. We then make sure everyone knows what they're supposed to do. This is kind of an important step, and it's a step that is often missing. So everyone gets training in whatever they're supposed to do in the system, and then they go away and do it. And you will have some results that come from that execution of the system. You will have a look at that result and you will try and decide what that result is telling you. So if everything is working really nicely, you should have assurance of the quality of what you're doing. And if we have regulatory requirements, a compliance with those regulatory requirements. Sometimes, however, those results tell you something different and you might need to make changes. Irrespective, from each of these points, there are things that you can learn about how you're operating as an organisation. So it doesn't matter whether it worked well or whether it didn't work well. You are always able to learn from that and improve what you do. So this is very much a cyclic process. And when we actually look at organisations, this is one of the things that we want to see happening in your organisations. So now I want you to just spend, we probably won't spend 10 minutes, about 5 minutes, thinking about your own organisations. So in light of what we have talked about so far today, how's your organisation doing? What kinds of arrangements do you have in place? What's working well? What do you think might be able to be improved? And are there any obvious gaps in your organisation that you think you might need to work on or address as a matter of priority? So this is something that you could do individually, or you can discuss it with your group, but I only want you to take 5 minutes. So is anyone willing to share any of what they thought their organisation was doing really well?
I think we disseminate our information quite well in regards to this. So we have our main policies and procedures handbook, but then we'll have an administration handbook, a trainer handbook, so that it breaks it down and sort of the policy and procedure and says this is how you need to do it.
Yeah.
So then everyone has the same handbook and works off of the same song sheet, basically.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Mm.
So in that, sometimes we see the trainer handbook and the student handbook almost identical. And of course, from the point of view of the student handbook, you need to address the same things, but they need to know their bit.
Mm.
And from the trainer's handbook, again, you're addressing the same things, but they need to know what it means for them. So I love the idea. It's just a decision on your part whether your books are fit for your audiences. And they probably are.
They are, yeah.
Yeah.
I think they are.
Yeah.
They're definitely different.
Yeah, good. That's what we like to see.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Anyone else want to share anything that they're doing well? They feel they're doing well? Yes.
I'm confident we have the right foundation, which is really important. So Cindy is literally has every brick in the base of the house built, and so for us now, I think our gap is making sure that other people understand why those pieces are so important.
Yes.
Because I can imagine we would be the place that you audit where our trainers would go, no, we have none of that stuff. We've never seen it. So now it's okay, well, why?
Shall we fess up to that, Cindy?
Wouldn't surprise me.
You know, some of them is like, have you read the training and assessment strategy on this one? What's that? Come on, you did your course.
Yeah, I know. And that's
where...
And we were just saying, it's almost like it's the administrative part of being a trainer.
Yeah.
You know, so how do I understand the policies, the procedures, the systems, all of the bit that's not the super fun front of room showing how much I know.
Yes.
How do we make sure that they also understand that that's a critical part?
Yeah.
And that obviously comes by making the right links. To say, well, it's because da-da-da-da-da.
Correct.
And the consequence of not doing it is da-da-da-da-da. So yeah, that's our biggest gap is now.
Yes.
I guess kind of operationalizing it, making it something tangible and real and part of their day-to-day.
So
Exactly.
instead of them saying, I do this because Cindy says I have to do this.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
So,
exactly. How many times have I heard that? A lot. It's one of that would be like a retirement, like if I could charge for every time I heard that, I would quite literally be on the beach in Tahiti. Yes. Okay, anyone else want to share maybe something they feel they're challenged with? You don't have to.
For myself, like I've just recently joined the RTO, but there were a lot of changes in the last 12 to 18 months. So even the way that they deliver or assess. So for me, it's getting those policies and procedures in place to adapting them from where the business was to where it is now.
Yes. That would be a big task too, I should imagine. Yes, keep you very busy. Okay, thank you. Peter, did you want to share?
Yeah. Just, I was looking at more making sure that you outline the student journey really well, is looking at what your organisation does and actually plotting the whole journey of a student. Because the one thing we all let go is we might do enrolment really well, the training and assessment you let down, or quality of what's been delivered. But on top of that, actually to outline the trainer journey too, as to what they're responsible for and what they need to be doing.
Yes.
Actually something we all take for granted that trainers know, and they're the ones that let it down. So
trainers don't know. Some do, but lots don't.
We assume they
Yes, we assume they do. Yep. But also, you know, like, so sometimes I see lots of casual trainers that work across many different organisations, and they have a sole expectation of what their role is, whereas the RTO has quite a different, each RTO has a different expectation of what their role is. And, you know, but we all do that. We all bring our own lenses to whatever it is we're looking at now. Our job as the RTO is to make sure they know how to do things our way and what our behavioural expectation is of each and every person in our organisation. Okay. Oh, Mel, yes.
I've got Sharon Richards who says we have good policies and procedures. need to take more time to train the trainers in them and use regular meetings with short education sessions. Also use SMS to enhance processes and improve student experience.
Fantastic. See the trainers again. Yeah, because, you know, for most organisations, our trainers are the front-facing part of our organisation, so it's really important that they get it right. All right. So now we're going to spend the rest of our time together having a look at a couple of areas from within our regulation where we have got some really prescribed requirements around how we do these things. So we'll look at records management and we'll look at third-party arrangements. So, records first. It's not the kind of record we're talking about, but it could be. So when we have a look at what a record is, like it's a document or an object, and often these days a record is digital, it's not necessarily a piece of paper, that is kept for a particular reason. And those reasons typically are about that you're going to take information from it and use it for some purpose, or there's a connection to a particular circumstance or event. So for example, let's say you had a complaint, you might have notes around interviews that were related to the complaint. So this is a record that is in connection to a particular event. So when we're thinking about records in our organisation, we have to decide what to keep. We also then need to decide how to keep it. So typically we'll have some kind of record management system, and the thing with records is they have a life cycle. So that life cycle can differ dramatically. It might be something that you need or want to use immediately, but it might also be something you need to keep for a much longer period of time. So in those circumstances, we've got to figure out what it is we're keeping and how we manage that information over the life cycle of the information. So you've noticed that we're using the word information there too. So we're not using the word data. So the focus is on information, not necessarily on data, and there's a really subtle difference between those two things. So when we talk about data, we're really talking about the facts or details from which information is derived. So individual pieces of data by themselves are rarely useful, but the information that you derive from them is often very useful. So for example, if we think about, for example, a test score. So I was with an organisation last week where we were doing some validation, and we were looking at the knowledge-based tests in that organisation. And so we were looking at which questions the students were getting correct and which ones they were getting incorrect. So each bit of data, whether the question was correct or incorrect, by itself didn't really tell us anything. When we looked at the pattern or the information that we're able to derive from it, there were 2 questions in that test that nearly every student got wrong. So that information is then useful for us because we go, why are they getting it wrong? Is it a dodgy question? Have we not taught them? Were we rushed? Did we rush over that on that day? So information is really what we are focused on in this. And so when we talk about records management, we tend to have a set of key questions that get asked. And you have probably all asked all of these at some point. So we look at what information should we keep, and the answer to that is going to be different for each of you, and I'll explain why in a minute. How long should I keep it for? How do I keep it? And depending on how long you keep it for, there might be multiple answers to this question. Who's actually responsible for that record? Who's allowed to access it? How should it be destroyed when it comes to the end of its life cycle? Who's actually going to destroy that record? And how will I monitor that my records management system is working? So for a lot of organisations, they have figured out this bit mainly, but a lot of this is left to chance. So what we want to do is to make sure that this isn't left to chance, and our system needs to take that into account. And there's lots of things that will influence our decision around the answers to those questions. So this is an absolute hierarchy, okay? So the primary influence that would help consider the questions on the previous slide is, what is the legislation that's relevant to us say about what we have to do with records? So, for example, you have legislation in the vet sector that tells you about particular records and how long you have to keep them. If you delivered any of the high-risk work units, there's legislation that talks to you about what you have to keep and how long you have to keep it for, and it differs state to state. So, for example, let's say I got a forklift ticket in Western Australia. WorkSafe in Western Australia says that I have to have records available for 30 years from the point of issue of that qualification to justify my decision to issue that statement of attainment. If I go to South Australia, their legislation says 99 years. So considering you have to be 18 to get the ticket in the first place, and then you add 99 years to that, now my maths isn't that great, but it makes me 117. So, you know, it's different depending upon what you do. So you have to know what legislation is relevant to you and what that legislation says about what you need to keep. Then you will go to regulation that supports that legislation. And again, depending on which area you work in, this can say different things. Sometimes you will also have additional guidance notes that are issued by the regulator. ASQA, for example, has a general direction around maintaining records, and that general direction says that you have to keep all of the evidence that has been used to make a decision about competence for 6 months from the time at which you make that decision. Out of audit processes, that can be changed. Sometimes that stretches to 12 months, to 18 months, to 2 years. So there is always a possibility that a regulator, not just your vet regulator, might give you some additional information about what they want you to keep and for how long and how. Then you might be getting funding from different bodies. So if you have a state government funding contract, most of the timeframes that sit in that sit at 2 years. There are some federal contracts, however, that ask you to keep things for 7 years. So you have to look at wherever the money comes from for your organisation. Are there any requirements or strings that are attached to it, and what does that mean? And then you would actually have a look at your own policies and processes and decide what you need to keep to do what you need to do. So, for example, doing validation in your organisation, doing internal audits, what do you need to keep and how long do you need to keep it for? And that will all depend on the cycle of how your organisation operates. So some RTOs offer shorter courses, and it's a bit of a churn type situation. So sometimes their students only come to them for 1 day. Sometimes they will have 10,000 students go through in a year. Other organisations offer longer qualifications. So there's one example I can think of. These lovely ladies that ran a herb farm, and they delivered a naturopathy diploma. So their students were with them for 2 years, and they had 10 students over 2 years. So, you know, you have these extremes in terms of how the cycle in the RTO works, and as a result, this looks different. So when you are thinking about records in your organisation and answering those questions, you need to go through and think about what all of this means for you, and that will form the framework around which you make decisions about what to keep, how to keep it, how long, and who's going to touch it. So we've just got a few examples here for you. So this is from legislation. These are our standards, which are, of course, are a piece of legislation. So it tells us that we have to keep an AQF register of qualifications that they are authorised to issue, and of all the qualifications that have been issued. So for most of you, your student management system does that. Retain that record of certification for 30 years. So you're actually your data reporting into your VetMIS does that. And provide reports of records of qualification issued to the vet regulator on a regular basis as determined by the vet regulator, whichever one it is. So this is an example from within our legislation. Here's some information from a regulator. It just happens to be TAC, and you might just have a copy of this on your desks. ASQA's got one too for the ASQA registered RTOs. So often the regulators will put out information around what they want you to keep for records, and in that fact sheet there's a table in there where TAC tells you what the kind of information that they would like you to keep to enable audits to happen in your organisation. Here's AMSA. There's an example from AMSA where it talks about the practical assessments, how to perform them, and what to do with the certificates of competency that come as a result of that. This is DTWD's funding rules. So you can see in there, service providers got to retain both evidence of commencement and evidence of assessment for a period of 5 years after the end. So it's all going to be different. So there is not going to be one answer for any single one of you. You're going to have to figure it out for yourself, what is right for your organisation. But those list of questions are the questions that at least you should be able to answer. Third-party arrangements. So this is a requirement that sits in four different standards that are in our regulation. And the reality is that there are many, many third-party arrangements that exist in the vet sector, and there's a very wide range of services that are actually provided to RTOs or to students through third-party arrangements. So one of the things that it's interesting how we see it from an audit perspective. We come into your organisations as outsiders into your organisation. We hear the way people talk about third-party arrangements and talk about the students that are in third-party arrangements, and it's often quite a disconnected discussion. So the classic example is the schools. So RTOs will talk about the school's students, but they are the RTO's students. The school is being contracted to deliver and assess on the RTO's behalf. So that's the first message that has to come out. If you're in a third-party arrangement, you are responsible for everything that is done in that arrangement. The buck stops with you as the RTO. With that in mind, and to manage the risk that is associated with putting, sometimes these services that are offered at an arm's length, there is often a whole lot of stuff that you would need to do or put in place to closely manage these relationships so that you can assure the quality of what is provided to the students who are, in fact, your students. And it is such a risk area in our sector that anyone who is engaged in a third-party arrangement has to notify their regulator of every single one of those third-party arrangements. So for each of the regulators, there's a way to do that. With TAC, you go on the TAC portal, and same with ASQA, you go into ASQAnet, and you will be able to notify that regulator of the agreement, and of course you must have a written agreement in place which in fact forms the basic governance of how that arrangement is going to be happening. So it is absolutely 100% expected that that written agreement is available at audit. Okay? And that everyone who's signed that agreement, is party to that agreement, knows what's in it and can answer to their bit of that agreement. So that is the other part, of course, that when you put a third-party arrangement in place within that written agreement, you have to have a requirement in there for whoever your third party is to cooperate with the regulators at audit. Okay, so everyone's involved, everyone's accountable for what they do. The RTO is responsible for what everybody does. Okay. So, a third-party arrangement is typically an agreement that covers these types of services. So, training and assessment is the most common type of third-party arrangement that we have in place, but it often extends to recruitment and marketing and educational support services. So, for example, you might have a specialist LNNN person or organisation that provides services to your client group. They might do all your testing and put plans in place for them. So these types of agreements are the things that absolutely must be included or be governed by this third-party agreement, this written agreement that you put in place. There's also some things that aren't third-party arrangements that RTOs will often seek an external party to perform for them. So things like student counselling, so we're talking about psychological counselling here, mediation, computer support, your IT support, a workplace supervisor who contributes to evidence collection, so for example in apprenticeships and traineeships, or your industrial officers, your prison officers, a contract trainer and assessor. We consider them your employee, not a third party. Or where a student has been referred by an employment services organisation and that organisation doesn't receive a payment. So for those employment services organisations, they have a government contract that in fact gives them the money to do the job that they do in terms of placing people either into work or into training. So these things don't have to be subject to a third-party written agreement in relation to our standards. However, it would be good practice if you did have some form of governance around these things anyway, because they're all things that can actually, in the long run, impact on your students in a significant way. So even though we don't require to be notified of that arrangement, it's still a requirement for you to govern those things. So let's have a look at some of these examples and see if we can decide if they are third-party arrangements or not. So let's have a look at the first one. Got a partnership with an employer who provides training and assessment services to its staff. I'm the RTO. I enrol the employees with my RTO and I provide certification to those employees who are successful. Would this have to be subject to a third-party written agreement? That's a yes. Because the RTO is enrolling and providing certification, but the employer actually provides the training and assessment. Okay, what about number two? I'm contracted by an RTO as a specialist trainer and assessor, and I train and assess for them a few times a year. Everyone in the room shaking their heads. They're considered an employer. That's right. I like this one. I'm a connector. I facilitate auspicing services for schools. Schools handle all the recruitment, training and assessment, and I connect them with an RTO who handles the certification and validation. Where does the agreement sit?
It sits with the RTO.
Yes. So this person, if we're saying, does this person, the connector, have to have an agreement with the RTO? The answer would be no. The school does have to have an agreement with the RTO. Yes. So sometimes when you have a look at these situations and you're thinking what has to be in place and what doesn't, they can be a little bit tricky, because there definitely has to be an agreement between the school and the RTO, but not this person. What about the marketing company? I market the RTO's qualifications and direct potential learners to the RTOs, and the RTOs take it from there. What if it's a magazine? What if it's the newspaper?
It's still being used by the RTO, no matter what channel you use to market.
Yes. So anyone who so we're saying any RTO who puts an ad in the community newspaper has to have a third-party agreement with the newspaper. So this is a really fine line. It's another fine line one. If let's say I was a direct marketing company and I was ringing the students and I was talking to the students and saying, oh, this RTO, they have this fabulous service, they do this, they do that, why don't you get in contact with them? And I send you some of their information and blah, blah, blah. Absolutely, yes. If this is the community newspaper, the answer is no. Because all the RTO is just putting an ad in the newspaper or sticking an ad in a magazine, and we're not going to have a third-party arrangement around that. So it's another fine line one.
So that's all dependent on the channel that they use.
Yeah, and really, hopefully what you're seeing here with these two in particular, it's about the contact with the student. So in both of these situations, we've said, if these people have contact with the students, the answer is yes. But if they're having zero contact with the student, it's just a medium, then the answer is no. I'm a specialist and I work with RTOs who have students at risk. I identify the students' needs at enrolment, and then I work with the students along their journey with the RTO. Yes. Yes. So even though we have nice clear lists saying these are agreements and these aren't, the reality is sometimes, as you can see with these two, we want to think quite carefully about it. So if you think about it in terms of whether that organisation has contact with the students, then that can be a helper in terms of making your decision. And of course, for those of you who work or are registered here in Western Australia, if you have any concerns about that, you can always ring your friendly regulation officer and ask the question, and we'll be more than happy to help you.
Just a question on the students at risk and how you define that, because before counselling was no, it's not a third-party arrangement. So how do you define students at risk?
So, for example, it might be that they need study skills help, or they might need LN&N help. They might need, for example, to be picked up, to be fed, to be like all kinds of things. Yeah, yeah.
But not counselling.
The psychological counselling is not included, and that's primarily around the confidentiality arrangements that exist with that. Yeah, and same with mediation.
So sometimes I've come across those refer a friend programs.
Oh yes.
Yes. So because it's a referral, but they get some kind of reward for that, right? So where would that fit into?
It's when they're getting a reward for it.
Yeah.
We don't really like them very much.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
But
it's a very fine line.
Yeah.
Very fine line.
Yeah.
And I think in all circumstances like that, like if that was a situation and I was the auditor, I would come back to TAC and say, please make a decision on this for me.
On social media, so many businesses promoting that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, yeah. And it's the same with organisations when they have that kind of information on their Facebook pages and things like that. Yeah,
yes,
yeah. And the incentive is being offered by the RTO.
Yeah, because my marketing team, I remember, came to me like, oh, this is really working out for them. We should go. That's like, I'm not so sure. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a very fine line.
Yes.
Be very careful.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Because the other part of that, you've got to link that to stands 4 and 5 and it's about the accuracy and completeness of the information. So when you've got information being passed in different channels that you don't have control over, you introduce another level of risk. Okay. So what is your responsibility as the RTO in this third-party arrangement? And the reality is everything. The buck really does stop with you as the RTO. So you are responsible for the quality of whatever services is provided to the student, irrespective of who provides it. So in the same way that you might allocate or delegate work to your internal staff members and you monitor what they're doing and you make sure that they're doing their jobs properly, you have to do the same things with your external third-party providers as well. In essence, they are functioning as an extension of your team. And when you start thinking about them like that, you tend to do things a little bit differently. So this is not something that we're going to do today, but I want you to think about this in your organisations. When you open up your organisation to a third party providing services for you, you invite a whole lot of additional risks into your RTO. Now, that's not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing, because risk is also about opportunity. So it brings a whole lot of opportunity to your organisation that you might like to consider whether you want to make the most of, but it also brings some negative things with it as well, which you have to consider how you're going to manage that additional risk. So within your organisation, when you do this, what kinds of things do you need to manage additionally to if everything was internal? So these are some other areas. So in addition to training assessment, which we said is the most common service that is offered, these are other services that are quite often provided through third-party arrangements. And so things like monitoring, training and assessment, record keeping, advertising, marketing, data, cooperating with TAC, you've got to make sure these things are in there. Informing prospective learners about what it is they are buying from you as an RTO, collecting fees and dealing with complaints and appeals. And in TAC's strategic audit that they did, this is one of the most common non-compliances that we found when we talked to students. They had no idea who they were supposed to complain to. So if they had an issue, they didn't really have a pathway to resolve it. So when you think about what has to be in your third-party agreements, think about these things. So TAC has a fact sheet on third-party arrangements, which is also on your desk. And in there is a whole lot of information about what should be in the written agreements and how you should consider those things. Out of that audit that we did last year into third-party arrangements in Western Australia, we found there were a whole lot of things that worked particularly well for RTOs that were compliant with the standards. And so these next few slides are about things that we know worked well for organisations. So there being a really clear contact in each of the parties to that organisation, so that there was a clear communication channel that could be taken or used when required. And that communication channel actually covered all kinds of things around the agreement. So it was really about the operations of it, the delivery of it, and monitoring the performance of the agreement. Prohibiting third parties from subcontracting, so you end up with a fourth party, basically. Don't do that. It's like you're a glutton for punishment if you do that. Validation of the third party's capacity to deliver, but capacity and capability to deliver before you start delivering, before you enrol students. So including things like all the physical resources, the facilities, whether they can meet the timelines, have they got the staff in place, does the organisation operate in a way that's actually going to enable it to meet the requirements of the standards. Generally having an on-site inspection of facilities prior to commencing is a good idea when you can see what they do and don't have. And sometimes this might include video or photo evidence in remote locations. Over the pandemic, we have done a number of audits remotely where we quite literally have had the RTO walking around with their phone showing us everything that is in the room with them and all the equipment that they have. One of the, like a really common thing is in a lot of work sites, and this is things like rigging and dogging and all that kind of stuff, when you have a look at those units of competence, they require you to have a lot of faulty equipment as well as working equipment. And often when you deliver on site, or someone delivers on site on your behalf, those work sites, when equipment is faulty, they get rid of it. They don't keep it. It's a real risk for them to have faulty equipment. So you often find that when you will go to sites, all the faulty things you need aren't there. So you have to manage that type of situation. Make sure that there's some kind of process in place to manage changes that happen. Sometimes they're changing the training material. Sometimes there's different trainers and assessors that come in. Again, this is a really common one in the schools, whereas the teachers cycle through. You notify any changes to the third-party operations that are going to affect their ability to deliver the services that are part of that agreement, and you would not only let everybody know who's involved, so that might be the students, for example, but you would also let the regulator know. Often visits by the RTO staff to the third party worked particularly well, and the more frequent they were, the more effective it was. The RTO doing a meet and greet with the learners on the first day. So even if the training and assessment happens or is delivered by somebody else, the fact that the RTO is there face-to-face in those first meetings provides that connection to the RTO. You take feedback from the learners, the trainers and assessors in evaluating performance. So it's not just based on what your third party says they have done. The people who are the receivers of the service are also asked about how they found things. Good. Fast learner. Yeah. I still don't.
Just on point 2, notification of any changes to third-party operations. Does this include, so you've got a third party in place with the organisation, you might have 5 trainers at the school who are engaged, you have skills matrix for them. As you said, they've turned over a staff member, maybe on long service leave. Do you have to inform TAC of a change of one single trainer?
If it impacted their ability to actually provide the service. So let's say that trainer was the only one that could do a particular thing. All of a sudden you've got an agreement in place that you can't deliver on anymore. So that's the kind of situation that we're interested in. And really what we're interested in is we know that the situation is there and that you're doing something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That there's some kind of performance management arrangement in place around the contract to decide whether the services were delivered in accordance with whatever the plan was. This is a really important one, to vet the marketing materials that have been produced, if a third party is producing them for you, to make sure they are actually accurate and current. We find some fabulous things that third parties say about what they're doing, and of course fundamentally in our sector we want everyone who engages with training and assessment to know who the RTO is and to know that that is who is issuing their certificate. So there are a few things that have been pulled out of a report that's available on TAC's website around that third party audit, and of course there is a whole lot of information, extra information in there that helps put those suggestions into context. So for our session today, we have actually used a number of our resources. Obviously the standards for RTOs. We've got a series of fact sheets that we've given to you on your desks today. And I'm going to put in a plug for the rest of the fact sheets that sit on the TAC website. That's another thing that's kept us busy over the pandemic when we weren't doing as much auditing, was to actually go back and review all of the fact sheets that needed review. And they are all available off TAC's website for you to download. And most of them have been touched, haven't they? Yeah. So if you might have printed them out and got them before, go back and have another look, because they have changed. And of course the user's guide that I mentioned before is also there on the website for you to access. Okay, so thank you so much for coming today. You've got our contact details here. If you have any questions that come up, or you would like to provide us with any feedback about how we could do the workshop better, please use these contact details. So thank you. We won't get to see you again before Christmas, so we wish your families and your loved ones a safe and peaceful time, and back in 2021 to start again. So thank you so much. Goodbye.